Truppen haben heute Nacht zum ersten Mal auf unserem eigenen Territorium auch mit der regulären Soldaten geschossen. Seit 5:45 wird jetzt zurückgeschossen.
We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches, we shall fight on the landing grounds, we shall fight in the fields and in the streets, we shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender.
The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. We will gain the inevitable triumph, so help us God.
The Nazis entered this war under the rather childish delusion that they were going to bomb everybody else and nobody was going to bomb them.
Sunday, June 22, 1941. German troops crossed the borders of the Soviet Union. The war they had started was an invasion, without a declaration of war. The soldiers were in a confident mood. They had been at war in Europe for 22 months, always accompanied by quick victories. They had conducted the Blitzkrieg extremely successfully so far.
For the attack on the Soviet Union, 3.5 million Wehrmacht soldiers were ready, divided into three army groups: North, Central and South. Army Group North was to advance on Leningrad, Army Group Center on Moscow, and Army Group South on Kiev, and then on the Caucasus. Thus, all the economic and political centers of the Soviet Union should be taken in a lightning campaign.
Since 3:45 that Sunday morning, German units had been advancing. 3 million German soldiers were moving rapidly east in forced marches. Right from the start, the German Wehrmacht took thousands of prisoners of war. There was still a certainty of victory.
The Wehrmacht succeeded very quickly in the first days in breaking through the Soviet defense lines and destroying the Soviet Air Force while it was still on the ground. And so the Germans, the Wehrmacht, penetrated very quickly in their first weeks to the east. However, with every kilometer it penetrated further east, the supply lines became longer and the Soviet resistance became stronger.
From the start, the civilian population was also targeted by the fighting troops. The German newsreels showed nothing of this in the first days of the war. They were convinced that they could crush Soviet Russia, the colossus with feet of clay, with one blow.
In the summer of 1941, the Wehrmacht was at the zenith of its capabilities. It had combat experience, it had learned lessons, it had long training periods, it had improved armament and ammunition, and the initial experience was we were vastly superior to the Red Army.
The invasion of the neighboring country was sold to the German population as a preventive war. On the morning of June 22nd, propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels, in a radio message, delivered a proclamation from Adolf Hitler.
Deutsches Volk, in diesem Augenblick vollzieht sich ein Aufmarsch, der in Ausdehnung und Umfang der größte ist, den die Welt bisher gesehen hat. Von Ostpreußen bis zu den Karpaten reichen die Formationen der deutschen Ostfront. Ich habe mich deshalb heute entschlossen, das Schicksal und die Zukunft des Deutschen Reiches und unseres Volkes wieder in die Hand unserer Soldaten zu legen.
For Hitler, it was always clear that the war against the Soviet Union would come, the great ideological confrontation between National Socialism with Bolshevism. At the same time, in Hitler's world, there were also economic and strategic reasons for attacking the Soviet Union. He failed to defeat Great Britain, so he thought, let's first defeat the danger in the east. And then afterwards, Hitler wanted to move all his forces to the west, first against Great Britain, and then in a big world war against the US.
The dictator believed that the campaign against the Soviet Union would last about 22 weeks. His generals assumed even less, only 8 to 17 weeks. Hitler regarded his opponent, Joseph Stalin, as an opponent to be taken seriously. The Soviet dictator was a clever head, a bloodhound, whose blood regiment of Bolshevism had to be put down as soon as possible. Stalin's Red Army was only partially operational after the Great Terror in the mid-1930s. Stalin had assassinated almost the entire military and party leadership to ensure his autocracy.
Those who rallied around him initially quite rightly assumed that the man's hand did not tremble, that he could handle any crisis, and that he had no qualms about using force against anyone, so that initially the followers voluntarily subordinated themselves to him. In fact, this was a dictator who played the henchmen off against each other, who had the means of power in his hands and controlled the secret service. And he established something like a despotism, which even the closest members in the leadership circle were afraid of.
Ever since the October Revolution, Soviet Russia had been regarded as the worst threat to the West. In the meantime, it had become a dictatorship with a personality cult focused entirely on Stalin.
The Soviet Union at the time, by the way, not only in Germany, was actually something like the evil empire.
Dagegen geht es jetzt für viele auch schon immer der Erzfeind.
And so this war, for many, was a war against the archenemy of the West, the civilized world. After a short period of getting used to the fact that now that the Hitler-Stalin pact had ended, the vast majority of Germans absolutely approved of this campaign.
When Adolf Hitler delivered a speech to a group of officer candidates at the Berlin Sports Palace in early December 1940, he had already been working solidly for weeks on a blueprint for war against the Soviet Union. He had also long since informed his generals of the inevitability of the attack. He also said it was necessary to create living space in the East and at the same time defeat Germany's arch-enemy.
While in Western Europe it was more or less clashes between two armies, in the East it was a clash between two ideologies. And not only between two ideologies, but also between two societies. That's how it was interpreted. And in order to make the Soviet regime collapse, the Nazis believed they had to specifically eliminate the Jews and the communists as proponents of that regime.
Hitler planned a campaign of extermination. Corresponding orders were formulated in advance. Political officers, for example, assigned to Red Army units, if seized in combat or resistance, are in principle to be finished off immediately with a weapon. The court-martial decree also exempted the killing of civilians by Wehrmacht soldiers from punishment. Officers' reactions ranged from outspoken approval to reluctant acceptance.
However, resistance was comparatively low. As always, of course, there was a material moment. The generals were lured by the fact that they were promised huge latifundia in this vast country, and this was then supposed to destroy doubts.
Many of these generals went along with it, aware that they were doing something forbidden. So, from the very beginning, the German generals compromised, went along with the crimes. Colonel General von Reichenau, one of the die-hard Nazi leaders, even justified and defended it publicly. Field Marshal von Manstein said that a Bolshevik political officer was not a comrade, and that one could shoot him without hesitation.
To enforce Hitler's barbaric concept of war, the Hamburg Reserve Police Battalion 102 was also detached. Their official mission to secure the rear areas. Their real mission to assist the SS Einsatzgruppen in genocide. In occupied Poland and Russia, they shot tens of thousands or deported them to concentration camps.
Resistance was expected by the Nazi rulers mainly from communists and from Jews.
Und von Juden erwartet.
And very quickly this order was interpreted as carrying out ethnic cleansing against the Jewish population and the communist intelligentsia.
Und gegen die kommunistische Intelligenz durchzuführen.
In Moscow, Joseph Stalin had to face the truth. Adolf Hitler had taken him by surprise. Nazi Germany and the USSR were at war. Horrified Soviet citizens learned about the invasion by the Wehrmacht from newspapers. They heard nothing from Stalin for the first few weeks after the invasion. The dictator left it to his deputy Vyacheslav Molotov to inform the population about the attack. The numerous warnings of his agents, which Stalin had dismissed as feints and deceptive maneuvers, now turned out, to his astonishment, to be true.
It deeply shocked Stalin that someone could be so stupid as to open a two-front war. He completely misjudged that. And that's why, interestingly enough, he was much more distrustful of the British and the French than he was of Hitler, because he saw Hitler as an authoritarian ruler and dictator who would act in exactly the same way as he would have in his place. That's why I think Stalin, for the first time in his life, was really surprised.
Nevertheless, contrary to rumors, the dictator kept his nerve. Mobilization, however, was slow to get off the ground. The Red Army, which had been bled dry, lacked experienced commanders.
Stalin was in control from the very first day of the war, and he organized the defense. He was, as always, a resolute ruler, and by no means panicked or hysterical. That would not have suited the man at all.
On July 3rd, Stalin, who, as supreme commander, now called himself Generalissimo, spoke to the Soviet people in a radio address to prepare them for the Great Patriotic War.
Подготовки своих сил для отпора, если фашистская Германия рискнула бы напасть на нашу страну вопреки пакту. Это определенный выигрыш для нас и проигрыш для фашистской Германии.
This had a great effect. Not only that most Soviet citizens heard the dictator's voice for the first time, he basically never appeared in public. They heard for the first time this man with the heavy Georgian accent, who spoke Russian with mistakes, who addressed his compatriots and immediately used this formula, brothers and sisters. There you see the old fox again, who recognized exactly what he had to do in which situation and what was needed now, and who could unhesitatingly throw all ideological reservations overboard if he could get any advantages from it.
Meanwhile, at Adolf Hitler's headquarters in Obersalzberg in Bavaria, reports were coming in of victory. At this point, the German troops had already advanced more than 500 kilometers toward Moscow. The German soldiers did not yet know what kind of war their leader had planned for them and what role he had assigned to them in this campaign of destruction. Many of them did not see any great danger in their imminent deployment to the front. Gerd Brügelmann, a young lieutenant from Paderborn, received his marching orders then. A year earlier, his only brother had been killed in France. As the last son of his family, he was not assigned to combat duty, but was put in charge of leading a supply train. The soldiers were still in good spirits, heading for a foreign country.
In Private Müller's war experience, the central thing was the fight. The boredom, the waiting, the marching. The foreign culture. Even the cheerful hours spent with comrades. The pride in one's military achievements, in one's successes. All that was in the foreground. The awareness that this was a criminal war, a war of aggression, was of course not there at all. So the war was also an adventure, a journey. The vast majority of Germans had not traveled, had never left Germany, had never left their village before.
At the beginning of their advance, the soldiers also received a friendly welcome in some areas, especially in the Baltic states, parts of Belarus, and in Ukraine, where the population hoped for better times after the end of Stalinist terror. But the joy of liberation was disappointing. Soon, the High Command relieved the soldiers of any duty of responsibility and declared that feeding the impoverished population was a misunderstood humanity.
In Ukraine, the Germans were welcomed very positively because they were seen as liberators from the Soviet yoke, which was also a foreign rule for the Ukrainian people.
The almost unimpeded advance allowed German troops to penetrate deep into the interior of the country. Thus, they quickly succeeded in encircling large areas.
Characteristic of the first phase of Operation Barbarossa were the so-called encirclement battles, that is, German tank forces had surrounded larger bodies of troops of the Red Army in pincer attacks, and thus encircled, they were closed off from supplies. And so there were huge numbers of prisoners in the first weeks and months of the war.
In one of the first of these encirclement battles around the Belarusian capital of Minsk, about 325,000 soldiers of the Red Army became German prisoners of war. The next objective in the advance of army groups centered towards Moscow was Smolensk. Here, the Wehrmacht encountered fierce resistance.
In erbitterten Straßenkämpfen dringen unsere Truppen am 16. Juli in die Stadt ein. 2 Wochen lang behauptete die sowjetische und britische Lügenpropaganda, Smolensk befinde sich noch in bolschewistischer Hand.
Today, when we look at the German advance in the Soviet Union, we are dazzled by the newsreel pictures. We see the encirclement battles. We see the huge streets full of Soviet prisoners of war. We see smiling German soldiers. But the Germans suffered immense losses in the advance. And this Wehrmacht was actually shrinking and shrinking. Because while many Red Army soldiers went into captivity, many also fought to the last bullet.
Weil natürlich gehen viele Rotarmisten in Gefangenschaft, aber sehr viele kämpfen auch wirklich bis zur letzten Patrone.
Contrary to what the newsreels claimed, it actually took 2 months before the German troops finally decided the battle in their favor. The Soviet leadership could not find an effective strategy against the lightning-quick advance of German troops. The huge mistakes made by the Generalissimo often benefited the Wehrmacht.
Stalin made the mistake of simply forbidding army leaders to retreat. As a result, they were constantly surrounded and huge army units were destroyed. They surrendered by the 100,000s because they realized that they couldn't use their military skills at all. They had no weapons, no boots, no uniforms. Their officers ran away or didn't lead them at all. As a result, the number of prisoners of war increased rapidly.
300,000 Red Army soldiers were trapped in the Smolensk basin. The Germans mercilessly crammed them into very confined spaces. The prisoners of war suffered from hunger and thirst. Soon, epidemics such as typhus were rampant in the camps.
In the end, the Wehrmacht failed to do everything that should have been required for humane accommodation. And this led to the biggest mass death in the German sphere of influence in 1941. 2.2 million died, and a total of about 3.3 million Soviet prisoners of war perished in German captivity.
It's believed that 50% or even over 50% of Soviet prisoners of war died in German hands. They were shot, or they starved, or they worked until they dropped.
Those who were lucky were supplied from surrounding villages. Often, impoverished farmers gave the prisoners their last bit of bread. A German officer noted in his diary, there was nothing to eat. Not even water. Many died. They were finally given dry macaroni to eat, which they pounced on madly.
Of all the crimes for which the Wehrmacht was responsible, I think the treatment of Soviet prisoners of war was the greatest crime.
Most Wehrmacht generals did not feel responsible for the mass deaths in the German camps. Responsibility for the conditions in each prison camp lay with the respective commander. Thus, the negligence was passed on from the upper ranks to the overburdened officers. In the camps, people were at the mercy of their guards as to whether they lived or died. Systematically, all those capable of working were registered and publicly stripped. The circumcised among them were immediately identified as Jews and deported or shot. In many camps, the guards behaved like a sadistic master race. Beatings and severe abuse were commonplace.
The idea that Germany was a superior power was widespread. The phrase, "the world shall be healed by the German essence," had been known for a long time. What was new, however, was this racialization of prejudices, where one spoke of Slavic subhumans and waged a war of extermination.
In the summer of 1941, SS Chief Heinrich Himmler visited a camp with Soviet prisoners of war near Minsk. When he witnessed a mass shooting, he lamented the strain that such actions would have on the perpetrators. Soon, he would give orders to begin forced gassing and setting up extermination camps. Not only were prisoners of war victims of the task forces, they systematically also killed Jewish civilians.
These were the extermination squads that followed the troops who at first received vague orders, which eventually leaned more and more in the direction of shooting all Jews. All men at first, but then also women and children.
Everywhere in the rear areas, the Wehrmacht supported the Einsatzgruppen as well as the police battalions assigned to them in their killing spree. In addition to Jews, political opponents, Roma, and Sinti, others considered unworthy of life in Nazi jargon were also eliminated. The SS troops were not the only ones who brought terror to the country. Wehrmacht soldiers also participated in the atrocities of the German murder squads.
The army groups that marched into the Soviet Union and the armies, which then always included SS units, which were divisions, that is, parts of this army, and therefore the Wehrmacht fought side by side with these SS units. So the Wehrmacht officers corrupted themselves by making common cause with these people.
In this war, everything was permitted. The murder of women and children became part of everyday life. Civilization was suspended, horror was unleashed. Inhibitions disappeared. Ordinary men became mass murderers.
Where killing was no longer forbidden, but ordered, and where it was morally justified, they said, what you're doing is not bad, you're doing it for a good cause. And where men knew that their friends, families, wives and children could not see what they were doing, they did it. Not everyone did it, but a lot of them, thinking nobody's going to find out. I don't think the Nazis could have organized these murder excesses at home, because then the man would have had to cross much larger thresholds.
Serious war crimes were also committed by the Germans on the southeastern front. In the battle for the Ukrainian capital, Kiev, the Red Army planted explosive devices in several buildings before retreating. The explosions killed several hundred members of the armed forces. The nationalist Ukrainians had welcomed the Germans as liberators. Now, together with Wehrmacht and SS officers, they demanded retaliation for the Bolshevik attacks. The troops then targeted Jewish civilians, especially the elderly, women, and children. Under the pretext of evacuation, the Jews were taken out of the city. On September 29th and 30th, 1941, an SS Einsatzgruppe systematically murdered 33,771 people with machine guns at Babi Yar. After the massacre, the Wehrmacht secured the area and blew up parts of the ravine to bury the piles of corpses forever. After the bloodbath, Einsatzgruppe C, in a report, explicitly praised the excellent cooperation of the Wehrmacht.
A lot of people went along with it, in the group, because the leader said this is what's going to be done now. And you didn't want to let your comrades down, so you went along with it. And because you were in a male hierarchy of the military, and you can see this everywhere in wars, the moment such military hierarchies are associated with everything being allowed, the violence escalates.
On August 27th, Hitler arrived in Ukraine for a visit with the troops. A field airport had been built near where the city of Uman had been bloodily conquered. The dictator was welcomed enthusiastically. Despite the high number of casualties and wounded, the Wehrmacht soldiers still wildly cheered their leader. The soldiers were convinced that the war would soon be won.
Hitler was the central person without whom such a war in the Soviet Union was not even imaginable. He was the link between ideology, state, military, and party. The soldiers saw things differently, in a way that seems crude to us today. They separated ideology and Hitler. Hitler was seen by many as the father of the fatherland, to whom one was also loyal, to whom also swore an oath. And then there was the evil party. Of course, we know today that that's insane, to separate the two. You can't separate them at all. But to the soldiers, Hitler was seen as a positive figure for an astonishingly long time in the war. This is, of course, an auxiliary construction to also explain why one continued to fight.
Italian dictator Benito Mussolini had also arrived to see for himself the progress of the campaign in which his troops were also involved. Hitler informed the surprised Duce that the conquest of Moscow was no longer a priority, but Leningrad was. Exactly what Hitler planned to do was communicated to the commanders of Army Group North in the secret command document of August 28th. The Leningraders had to be destroyed by starving them to death. After surrounding the city, any evacuation by the civilian population must be prevented, if necessary, by using weapons.
Behind this, of course, was the calculation that a city of millions like Leningrad could not have been supplied at all. The Wehrmacht and the Germans did not want that at all. They didn't want to get the civilians on their side. If they had wanted that, they would have fixed it, but they didn't want to. And that's why the decision was made to surround the city and starve it out. Of course, there have been sieges since ancient times. There's also been starvation in besieged cities since ancient times, but the idea of now starving a city for months and then actually starving the population to death, that's a unique event, at least for modern times.
On September 8th, the siege ring closed around the city and its 3.3 million inhabitants. All supply lines were cut off. Thus began one of the most perfidious crimes of the Wehrmacht. The German Luftwaffe dropped incendiary bombs over the city. Tons of food was burned. Soon, a large part of the population suffered from hunger.
An unbelievable number of people starved to death, became cannibals. Terrible scenes took place in Leningrad. If you meet older people in Petersburg who had experienced this, they cannot forget it for the rest of their lives. They had never seen a German, but they can't forget how terrible it was and how it changed social relations within weeks, because people couldn't think of anything else but the next piece of bread.
After the onset of winter, the mass death planned by the Army High Command began. Many froze to death because they had no fuel left. But the worst was the hunger. According to estimates, 1 in 3 Leningraders starved to death during the 900-day siege, more than 1 million people.
Stalin cynically exploited them for his regime by not doing much to ensure the survival of these people in the city, because he knew it played into his hands when the Nazis treated the population in this way.
Meanwhile, Army Group Center continued to march on Moscow. The Soviet capital was supposed to have been conquered by August, but by the end of the month, the breakthrough had still not been achieved. Nervousness began to spread in the Wehrmacht High Command. To relieve the overstretched supply lines, the OKW released whole swaths of land for looting. To prevent this, the Red Army also set fire to many villages. During the course of the winter, the population suffered severe famine and tens of thousands died.
The life of the enemy didn't count for much. You also got to see how the Red Army waged war, with the huge numbers of casualties they operated. How the Red Army kept attacking their own positions, their own machine gun fire, death-defying. This creates an image that the lives of the citizens of the Soviet Union didn't actually count.
Those who went home on leave saw their own family as if it was a different world. On the surface, the idyll in the garden at home was undisturbed. But the father of the family didn't even take off his Wehrmacht uniform at home. The war was also finding a way into the immediate family circle. Even the youngest practiced military drills to please their father.
The soldiers who came home on leave from the Eastern Front thought that the home they were in was completely surreal. They suddenly came to an area where Easter was celebrated and Christmas, and there were little children singing, and the world was still fine, even though there were bombing raids. And they couldn't talk about their experiences in that environment. They couldn't tell their wives about their bodies being torn to pieces, about their brains being blown out, about mass shootings of Jews. That's seen it all.
The frustrated Wehrmacht units became increasingly ruthless, but a lightning victory failed to materialize. Their proven strategy threatened not to work this time. In fact, the motorized units of Heeresgruppe Mitte had only about 1/3 of their inventory left. Winter was approaching. Villages were ruthlessly looted and burned to the ground. Many peasants hid in the forests. In order to survive, they joined forces with scattered Red Army soldiers and guerrillas to form partisan groups. Contrary to Soviet propaganda, these motley groups were poorly equipped with few weapons and little ammunition. Nevertheless, they hit the Wehrmacht hard.
The officers of the Wehrmacht and the General Staff believed that they could wage a blitzkrieg there, just as they had done in France and other countries in Europe. But they had not thought at all about whether there were actually roads in the Soviet Union. And then they discovered that the Soviet Union did have a road network. But it was very primitive. There were these so-called Great Rolling Roads. They connected the big cities and went through the Soviet Union, leaving thousands of kilometers of no man's land behind them. They didn't control that at all. So they drove in with these columns of tanks, but they left behind them areas that they hadn't conquered at all, areas that they just drove through.
Partisan sabotage attacks carried out from these rear areas repeatedly set the Wehrmacht back. The wounded from these attacks could often only be cared for inadequately, as supplies did not reach them in time. Meanwhile, on October 8th, Hitler let the domestic and foreign press know that the Soviet Union had finally been defeated. In October, the Wehrmacht still achieved one major success. Then, the the advance came to a standstill.
The Wehrmacht was actually finished after the last big battle of the Bryansk and Vyazma basin in October of 41. And the troops said, enough, stop, winter position. Bring supplies forward, bring winter clothing forward. We can't go any further. And it was the Army General of Staff, not Hitler, who said, never mind, even as they knew about the dire situation of the soldiers, they still had to make one last big effort to take Moscow.
The losses of the German divisions increased daily, but the military leadership didn't develop any alternatives to its failed strategy. The toll of blood paid by the soldiers for the failures of their leaders was high. More and more cemeteries filled the landscapes. A field chaplain described the mood of his superior after a funeral in the field. The colonel's face has changed in the last few days. He stands silently in front of the long rows of graves. There lies my old guard. Actually, we belong there too. Then it would be over.
There was a high degree of frustration among the soldiers. Everything took much longer. The weather conditions were getting worse. You stood in the mud. The nutritional conditions were getting bad. There were no longer sufficient or only very intermittent supplies. And by no means was the war going to be over in 2 or 3 months.
In mid-October 1941, the Russian autumn set in, and with it came the rains. Lieutenant Brügelmann's supply train was also advancing slower and slower. The so-called Rasputitsa slowed the advance of the Germans with rain and mud. Little by little, all the dirt roads of Eastern Europe turned into an impassable quagmire.
The German advance came to a halt shortly before Moscow, because by then the supply routes were simply overextended too far. And besides, the Germans already had huge losses. By the end of 1941, the Germans had already lost about 1 million men, dead, wounded or captured. There were losses that the Wehrmacht leadership and Hitler had not planned for.
In Moscow, Stalin knew how to use the time he gained. Thousands of civilians built barricades and tank trenches. Then, the strategic reserves from Siberia arrived and marched from Red Square directly to the front. Meanwhile, reports from German aerial reconnaissance units about massive troop deployments in the Moscow area were dismissed by the German leadership as ghosts. Stalin entrusted the leadership of the life-saving offensive to a hero of the Soviet Union, General Georgy Zhukov. On the other side of the world, Franklin D. Roosevelt adhered to the principle of good neighborliness and considered any imperialist expansion of his country as unreasonable. Thus did the U.S. president become the antagonist of the expansionist Axis powers. Roosevelt knew that sooner or later his country would have to intervene in the conflict, but the majority of his countrymen were against entering the war.
The main tendency in the United States at that time was to say, we have completely different problems to solve in our own country, especially of an economic nature. We need everything now, but not war. We don't need to enter here. And Roosevelt, too, had actually said quite clearly that he wanted to put an end to this American imperialist policy.
Mit dieser amerikanischen imperialistischen Politik Schluss machen möchte.
In particular, the U.S. felt threatened by Japan. The Japanese had continued to arm themselves and had been waging a war against China for years in violation of international law. Finally, the United States suspended all trade relations with Japan and imposed an oil embargo. They responded with a secret plan of attack on a U.S. base in the Pacific.
On the Japanese side, there were definitely military people who felt that they had really been backed into a corner. For these military men, there had to be this attack on Pearl Harbor at all costs, in order to free themselves from this feeling of being backed into a corner. In that sense, Pearl Harbor was clearly liberating strike.
So gesehen war Pearl Harbor ein eindeutiger Befreiungsschlag.
Located nearly 3,700 kilometers southwest of the California coast, Pearl Harbor had been home to the U.S. Pacific Fleet since 1940. Undetected, a Japanese fleet approached the Hawaiian Islands. The Kido Butai had covered 6,000 kilometers. It was December 7, 1941. And at 10 minutes to 6, the Japanese aircraft carriers moved into position. Half an hour later, 185 planes took off. It took the attackers an hour and a half to reach their destination.
It was the first time in human history that an attack had been conducted this way, with a total of 6 aircraft carriers, a combined attack from the sea, but just with units attacking from the air.
Aber eben mit Einheiten, die aus der Luft angreifen.
140 ships, including 8 battleships and 29 destroyers, were anchored in Pearl Harbor at the time, but they were considered obsolete. Some had already been in service during the First World War. Their relocation to the middle of the Pacific was intended to send a message to a belligerent Japan.
This deployment of the fleet to Pearl Harbor was a very clear statement, a very clear signal from the United States that said, we're not going to completely sit idly by and watch what's happening here in Asia and what Japan is doing in Asia, even if we don't directly intervene militarily now. At least, we're showing a presence in this way.
At 7:48 a.m., the first Japanese fighter planes attacked, followed by formations of dive bombers and torpedo planes. The message to Mission Control, Tora, 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 was the agreed signal that the surprise had succeeded. The Japanese attackers documented their success with a camera as the first bombs hit the Ford Island airfield. Shocked and surprised, the soldiers and sailors came to the realization, this is not a drill.
Washington had anticipated that sooner or later there would probably be armed conflict in Asia. However, it had more strongly expected that it would happen somewhere in Southeast Asia. But Japan had not been figured to actually attack the heart of the Anglo-American presence in the Asia-Pacific, that is, the Pearl Harbor naval base, which was armed to the teeth.
More than 2,400 American soldiers died. 19 warships were sunk or damaged, and around 200 aircraft were destroyed. U.S. soldiers were forced to watch helplessly as the Japanese reduced their huge naval base to rubble within 2 hours. Pearl Harbor became the most bitter defeat in American naval history. The next day, President Roosevelt declared war on Japan.
On the Japanese side, there was a misconception, because they had a misconception about the American politicians. They actually thought Americans, the white people in Washington, they are somehow weak, and if they suffer such a drastic, heavy surprise blow, then they will give in. Then they will enter into negotiations. And that's where they were very wrong.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. The facts of yesterday and today speak for themselves. With confidence in our armed forces, with the unbounding determination of our people, we will gain the inevitable triumph, so help us God.
Hitler, too, was surprised by Japan's attack. The dictator kept the promise he had made to his ally in case of war. On December 11th, the Third Reich declared war on the U.S. The European war now became a world war.
The interesting thing about Pearl Harbor is that it was not the US that declared war on the German Reich. Rather, it was actually Hitler who reacted immediately after Pearl Harbor, who immediately arranged for American ships to be sunk, and who declared war on the US. For him, it was actually a welcomed event to create very clear fronts that sent out a very clear message. On the one hand, Germany stood on the side of Japan against the Anglo-Americans and the Soviet Union, so very clear front lines were created.
Gegen die Angloamerikaner und die Sowjetunion. Also wurden ganz klare Fronten geschaffen.
The front in the Soviet Union at the time was 50 kilometers from Moscow city limits. On December 5th, the Red Army struck back. The offensive hit the surprised German troops with full force. Just a day earlier, the General Staff had announced that the Red Army was, at the time, not in a position to attack Army Group Center.
The biggest enemy for the Germans was, first of all, the Russian geography, the Russian winter. The problem that a huge army could not be supplied over huge distances. Logistically, it didn't work. The Germans didn't even have winter equipment because they thought that the war would be over in September of 1941, and the Soviet troops used that to their advantage.
By mid-December, the Red Army had averted the threat of Moscow's encirclement and was gaining ground on its side. With the weather at 40 degrees below zero, only a few German soldiers were equipped with sufficient winter clothing. 2,500 of them died every day.
Moscow,
the counter-offensive of the Red Army, what foreign armies east, the German intelligence service wrote on the eve of this offensive. An offensive is not to be expected. The Germans simply could not imagine that the Red Army would do that. They also didn't understand what reserves the Red Army still had. They didn't understand this country either. They had no real knowledge. Even for the intelligence service, Russia remained a foreign country. And what critical voices that did exist in 1941 were pushed to the side.
Unfazed, on December 18th, Adolf Hitler gave the weakened troops the order to fanatically persevere. At the same time, the dictator forbade any retreat. He fired dissenting generals, some of whom beat him to the punch with requests to resign. On December 19th, Hitler finally seized supreme command of the army and relieved the previous commander-in-chief, Walter von Brauchitsch, of his command. On the home front, an ideal world was created. Those who were wealthy, like the Henkel family of merchants in Hamburg, spent Christmas with their loved ones. The father, Hans, had not yet been called up. 3 years later, the family would receive his last letter from the Eastern Front. Hans Henkel would die fighting near Budapest, but the Germans still had no idea of their impending defeat.
On the home front, it didn't matter. If you watch newsreels from December 1941, from January 1942, you realized you couldn't actually tell what was going on. There you were fighting somewhere in a frozen area outside Moscow for villages that you had never heard of.
The situation for the German troops was hopeless. The temperature was around minus 40 degrees, rifles and guns jammed, engine oil and gasoline congealed. The arms and legs of the soldiers holding out froze. The German attack on the Soviet Union, Operation Barbarossa, had failed.
This caused a shock effect among the soldiers. Now they saw the weakness of the Red Army. It was all lies. It wasn't true at all. The Red Army was well equipped. There were soldiers who were brought in from the east of Siberia in ski suits. They realized that they were being burned there, that they had to walk around in women's fur coats, and that they were cannon fodder. The aura of the invincibility of the Wehrmacht was gone. And I think most of the soldiers in the Wehrmacht knew in the winter of 1941 that this was going to go wrong.
Gerd Brügelmann's hard-hit supply unit had also been stationed outside Moscow since the end of November. Unexpectedly, the lieutenant was ordered back to Paderborn for a new assignment. The journey home took him via Smolensk and Berlin. He was on the road for a week in a hospital train. Arriving in Paderborn, the horrified officer learned that his entire unit had been destroyed in a battle outside Moscow shortly after his departure. The Lebensraum in Osten, The living space in the East had turned into a hostile no man's land. Hitler's war was sinking into frost, snow, and ice.